Hello there, and welcome to Creatives in Conversation, a podcast series created by myself, visionary artist Roberto Picciau. In today's conversation, I'll be speaking with artist Eve Cromwell. And today we'll be having a discussion about the work that Eve creates, as well as, a little bit more about what kind of motivates Eve and what is it that's inspiring her at the moment. And anyone who has seen the podcast before will be familiar that I usually start off with a question, which is just basically, can you describe to us what it is that you create? So lovely to finally meet you, Eve.
Yeah, you too.
We'll take it away.
Yeah, sorry, jumping in there. So I guess I'm an artist, and I'm not really bound to any kind of certain practice. I just really love material and love playing with it, and yeah, that's it really. Like I'm recently getting into functional sculpture and the idea of design. I love kind of like modernist architecture and like modernist thinking. So I feel for the past few years, that's what has kind of dictated my practice a lot, is a lot of thinking about space and influenced by modernism.
Right, okay. You talked a bit there about like functional objects or functional space. Could you describe to us a little bit what that is, just for anyone who isn't sort of familiar with that terminology, or what it means for like modern architecture or modernist architecture?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess like the functional avenue comes through kind of just my love for design. I've kind of spent a lot of my time really enjoying like a piece of furniture or a lovely building. So I feel like it is a complete 180 from like what I was doing in my degree. I did a glass and ceramics degree, so it was very much like, this is a pot, this is a glass, this can be useful, this can be sold. And I was like, at the time I was like, nah, like no way. I want to be a contemporary artist, I want to be conceptual. But now I've kind of, I don't know, it's weird. I've kind of come around to the idea of just beautiful made furniture. But I guess in terms of sort of like modernist architecture and modernist design, the kind of ethos and maybe the more kind of political side of it is something that really interests me. Kind of the idea of designing a space for people and kind of designing it in the most sort of like maybe efficient or the best way that you think a person can live. Trying to design for that and also making it gloriously beautiful. A very bad rundown of the definition of modernism.
That sounds very interesting though, doesn't it? Because maybe it's something that a lot of us take for granted about the environments that we're in and the furniture that's in those spaces, and this idea of efficiency. I'm curious to know how those themes kind of take form within your work. Like, how would you describe the work that's created? Like, just for anyone who's listening to this, can kind of get a bit of a mental image as to what the work might look like.
Yeah, so recently, I guess my practice is kind of taken in this kind of turn. Kind of after I graduated, I was thinking a lot about public space and kind of like the way we move through space, but also how it's designed and how kind of a lot of our public space kind of reflects the society we live in. And like if you think about the street furniture that is around and the way that spaces are designed for people to congregate or not congregate, and like whether some stuff is like private or like private but pretending to be public space. Like I think the sort of politics of the space that we occupy is really exciting. So kind of a lot of my more recent work is about was about that really, and kind of like looking at public space, but also trying to almost design for the future. Like a lot of the stuff that inspires me is like post-war architecture and kind of like things from the 60s and 70s. And that was a time where we were kind of like rebuilding the country, and we had like this utopian vision in our minds. And it's funny because like my love is brutalist architecture, but everybody now thinks it's like so dystopian and sad looking. But when it was like made, it was the buildings of the future. Like they were supposed to be like glorious places for people to hang out and like live in. And yeah, I think that's really exciting. So I guess like kind of the work I make is kind of looking at what we have around us and how that the design of it might change as we change, but trying not to do it in a dystopian sense, which I think when I think of the future, I think of dystopia, but kind of doing it in a sort of way of, yeah, kind of trying to regain that spirit of optimism. Yeah.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because what I have been trying to do within these conversations is almost shy away from talking about sort of the current situation we're in at the moment with the COVID pandemic, and also the sort of situation of us all being in lockdown. But I find it quite interesting you mentioning about post-war, this vision after the war about changing environments and looking at things differently. I guess it's more just curiosity in my own mind to see how things develop and whether there might be a reimagining of what spaces could look like. Obviously, we're in a different situation. We haven't experienced any loss of buildings per se, but it's quite interesting, obviously, how events and periods through time might actually influence that reimagining.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to know how you'd want to reimagine society or spaces that maybe you live in or the world that you see in front of you.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, the COVID thing is really interesting because I feel like, you know, in the first lockdown, people really, really appreciated having a garden, you know, because they weren't allowed to go out and things like that. So, like, it's yeah, it kind of made me confused because I was so like, oh my God, civic space, public space, like so into that. And then it was like, oh, actually, like if you live in like one of these like housing projects that I love, like Biker Wall, like you don't have your own garden to like relax in. You know, and I've always kind of been of the opinion that, you know, you have a public garden for everybody to enjoy. And I also think it's interesting as well, like all of these like 2 meter boxes and stickers. Like I like to think of like in the future, we're uncovering like the the archaeological layer that is now, and like people might see these kind of like markings on the floor and like be like, oh, what happened here? But in terms of kind of like the future I want to see, I don't know, like I feel like if I could live in any time, I would live in the future that was imagined in the 70s. So like a specific time that never existed. But I like this, the idea of forward thinking and I don't know, yeah, just pure optimism. And everything looked really cool. It was kind of like made out of like fiberglass and stuff, which is, yeah, exciting. But some of my pieces, I guess, kind of, I did one of like a manhole cover that said free broadband on it. And that's kind of like these maybe like these overlooked pieces of like infrastructure that we don't think about a lot. So like I love a good manhole cover or a good like traffic cone. And I like to think about maybe these like little elements that don't really get thought of when we think about like the grand scheme of the future. Kind of, yeah, I think I'm not big picture enough to be like, this is what my utopia will look like. But maybe I'll be the little guy that sort of, just the little tiny details.
It's interesting that, isn't it? Because when you kind of think about the environments that we live in now, even if you're thinking about that, the 1970s kind of utopian imagery or architecture that they were trying to aim towards, it's a lot of it's quite minimalist, isn't it? Like it's kind of like a very reduction, basic shapes. I mean, not all of it's like that, but there's kind of a sense of an aesthetic that sort of goes across the board, and it's quite interesting because when you do look at a lot of modern cities now or town spaces, there's often a bit of a mismatch, a mix and match.
Yeah.
It's like I'm losing the words. It's like a variety of different styles and aesthetics. When a building pops up, and it's often whatever architect has designed that building for that space will have done it, and whether that architect or whoever's decided to have this aesthetic within this space might not necessarily always consider maybe creating a building that is cohesive with the rest of the buildings. So it is interesting how you're talking a little bit about what people's visions are in terms of spaces and architecture, but also how then that translates into a visual aesthetic. And then you mentioned a little bit about materials there, and it's obviously interesting because maybe the fiberglass stuff maybe isn't something that people would gravitate towards to now. Maybe it's more of a signifier of the time, perhaps. Yeah, I don't think that was a question. I guess it was kind of just a summary or something like that. So.
No, yeah, I really like it. I like the idea. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I've recently started watching The Prisoner, and I'm so into it. This kind of like 60s kind of like sci-fi. Is it sci-fi? I don't know. Kind of drama, and kind of a lot of that is just gorgeous. It's like shot in Portmeirion in Wales, and it was kind of like this town built by this kind of like very rich bloke that was supposed to, he basically wanted to build an Italian village like in Wales, and it's so cool, and it's insanely kitsch. Like it's so strange to see it, but yeah, like I kind of like, I don't know, I feel like watching The Prisoner has made me appreciate maybe other styles, because his house is amazing, but there's kind of like a lot of good aesthetics in there that I wouldn't necessarily go for. But I also like this idea of kind of like being able to date trends. I've been thinking more recently about kind of what people, instead of thinking about like the wider world and kind of what that might look in the future, thinking about what we put in our homes and what we decide to put in our homes, and how you can kind of like date a lot of furniture and a lot of things that people own, and kind of like how that came to be, and things like that. Like I think about like house plants being really popular at the moment, and there's theories going around to think that like it's because people can't afford to have children, and that we all have landlords and they don't allow pets, so we just have to have plants instead. And I think that that's really interesting, that the kind of like the politics is kind of influenced how people choose to decorate their homes. Yeah, and it's funny that you say minimalist, because that is so true. Like I love to think of myself as a modernist, but I own so much crap. Like I own so much tat. Yeah. and that's very overwhelming. I like what I profess to be and what I actually am. Two very different things.
So there's kind of like a big emphasis on aesthetic, isn't there? There's kind of the sense of you like the style of the past. Maybe something nostalgic there, perhaps. I think a lot of us are quite guilty of that, to kind of sort of dive into the past for, how we imagine the 60s or how we imagine the 70s, and what we read up about those times and what those visions were. I'm quite interested in this idea of the reasons why people have a lot of houseplants. I know, me and my partner have a lot of houseplants, and
I can
we
see
also
them.
have.
They look lovely.
And we have 2 dogs as well, and I have heard this idea of the times and how people are having children later on in life, and then how that might necessarily, because of those circumstances, change the environment itself. I am really interested in that idea because I do have some experience of working with people who are particularly unwell mentally, and they may hoard or may gather a lot of possessions. And when you sort of enter these environments and you see all these possessions, and you might sort of glance over those environments and think, what's the worth of all these things? But if you were to ask the person that each individual thing will have a story behind it, a meaning why it must be retained. But then it's also interesting to just think about the actual fabric of the building, and how the shape of that will also be informed by someone's idea of what they want the future to look like, or what they want that space to feel like, or what it wants to embody. So it is very interesting. I think it's a very overlooked thing a lot of the time. I do remember in the past having a conversation with someone about how we do need to think about spaces more in terms of how they impact upon our psychology. Because I guess we were talking about the 1970s architecture or 1960s architecture, and people are saying it's utopian. That they're imagining it in that sense, and then there's other people who think, oh, it actually looks dystopian now. So it's interesting how those meanings, or what they kind of meant at some point, have changed over time. I wonder why that is.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it is quite strange. I mean, I have a friend that says that the movement against flat roofs is like a neoliberal conspiracy, which I really love, and I love to repeat it. But this kind of idea, I don't know, I can't help but feel that it's quite like political again, and I feel like a lot of the stuff that is brutalist is kind of like civic buildings, and they have been destroyed and sold a lot. But also, I guess, in terms of like housing projects, like a lot of it is sort of due to underfunding and kind of like lack of upkeep and stuff like that. So it's kind of, it feels a bit sad to be like, oh, like these buildings are horrible and this project is horrible, because it had such a vision behind it that it's kind of been very much like neglected and dismantled by governments that have preceded it. So yeah, it is interesting. Like I love the sound of of the lots of objects and them all having a story. I think that's exciting. Kind of, yeah, I would definitely call myself very sentimental. Maybe not nostalgic, but sentimental.
So I'm curious to know a little bit about your involved, because you were mentioning before how you've been involved in curatorial projects, and it kind of ties quite well into obviously your interest anyway with space and architecture and objects as well. So I'm curious to know a little bit more about your curatorial projects.
Yeah, so I'm one half of the spaghetti factory. So Jenny isn't here today, but she's the other half, Jenny McNamara. And we started putting on exhibitions in our house in 2018. So we had this like beautiful kind of, I don't know, it felt quite swanky at the time, and it probably does compared to my house now, but it was very nicely finished and just like a gorgeous shape. And when we moved in, the wall was this like horrible sort of like deep red kind of wine color, and it just didn't look right. So we painted it yellow, and then we decided to put exhibitions on this yellow wall in our house. Um, yeah, so that kind of came about, and then we all moved out, and we decided to kind of work with other organisations and become little parasites, basically. So we are now satellite. So we kind of partner up with different organisations. So we're both on the Newbridge Programme Committee. That was kind of like a side project, but we've also been working with Sunderland Culture. So we've put on 3 exhibitions for them. And the latest one actually went up yesterday. It's a billboard. And yeah, my dream has always been to have an exhibition on a billboard, and I'm so happy that it is done. The artist is Matthew Dowell, and yeah, his work is just absolutely fantastic. We commissioned like a new piece to be up in Sunderland. But I guess our interest with that kind of, yeah, it's quite interesting because mine and Jenny's practice is very different, but a lot of it is, yeah, very much about space and thinking about, you know, kind of the thing that really gets me going about it is kind of like, oh, like we've got this challenge that we've got like no money or very little. How can we like put on an exhibition in that way? Or, you know, I guess the newest challenge was like, oh, galleries are closed. How can we put on an exhibition? And then kind of like at the same time, like we're utilising and sort of like claiming this public space. But it makes me feel a bit guilty because I think now I should have just pasted up the billboard and we shouldn't have paid for it. I've been reading this manifesto, this book called Advertising Shits in Your Head. And it's all about public space and about like billboard advertising and like how basically adverts are renting kind of public space off people in order to fill your minds full of rubbish, and how basically it's our civic right to take down those adverts or put whatever we want up. So now I'm like, should have just pasted it, but if somebody pastes over our billboard, I'll be absolute raging.
Well, obviously, the idea of putting up a billboard is interesting in of itself. But I was very interested in what you were saying about advertisements there. It's something that I've become a lot more conscious of recently, and if anything, become quite intolerant of adverts as I've gotten older. But I'm also noticing other people saying the same thing. I don't know whether it's a case of maybe the landscape's changing in terms of how advertisements reach us. And the billboard is almost like the last frontier where people almost can't escape that. And then obviously you've got this bombardment on the internet as well. And that's quite interesting because you're obviously talking about how they're occupying space within your mind. So, yeah, I could kind of see the crossover in terms of space of the mind and then space of the external space, and then how those two things intersect. But yeah, just whilst you were kind of mentioning about the adverts and how it's our civic right to remove the adverts, it was making me think of I don't know if you've ever... There was a recent film that came out by Werner Herzog called Into the Inferno. And it was actually about volcanoes, but there was a side part to it where it then started talking about North Korea and North Korea's connection to a volcano. But there was just this scene where the camera's just filming going down to the subway, and on both sides of the stairwell there's no advertisements of any kind, and as you carry on traveling through, like to the trains, there's no advertisements of any kind. I mean, whether there's any other kind of imagery is something else, but it's interesting. It kind of just made me think about this idea of what would life look like without these images there. And I guess if we are to think about what advertisements are trying to do, is they're trying to persuade you to buy something, to do something. So it'd be interesting to think about a space where there isn't that sort of level of, I don't think manipulation's the right word, but constant persuasion, constant attempts to influence and suggest you to follow a new behaviour, a behaviour that's in somebody else's interests. Does the imagining of your kind of utopian society, I don't know if utopian's probably the word you would use, does that include adverts for yourself?
Probably not. Like, there's a city in Brazil, and I think I'm probably gonna ruin the name, Sao Paulo, I think, and they banned adverts. So they actually did this like a few years ago, probably like 10, maybe more than 10 years ago now, and they just decided, like, citywide ban on all adverts. So they took down billboards, they took down like bus stops, they took down this, that, and the other, and they even, if your sort of like your sort of like shop front was too flashy, like they kind of like got you to take it down. You couldn't fly on the street or anything like that. And they actually described it as kind of like visual pollution, is how they would call like adverts. And yeah, I think that that's a really interesting experiment. There were things that happened, and actually I think they're kind of like reintroducing like smaller sort of like billboards, and like 9 of them now or whatever, because I guess like adverts give money, or like, you know, if you put a billboard up, then you kind of like pay for the bits of the building that the billboard stuck to, or bridges or whatever. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think I probably wouldn't. I don't know. I think I maybe the idea is to like not have no adverts, but to have like the kind of system in which like a billboard exists to be more democratic, you know, to be kind of not one where anybody that pays can get this thing, and to have it kind of more of like a forum maybe. But yeah, it was really interesting when we were kind of putting up our billboard. There was lots of like stipulations of things that you couldn't put on a billboard, and one of them, which might turn into a piece maybe one day, but one of them was like, the billboard that you put up can't look like graffiti, and it can't look like, one of them was like, it can't have any smashed glass on it. So like it's kind of like literal, almost like broken windows theory, like in action, this idea of like, oh, if you make your billboard tatty, then it's going to make the area like tatty. But I found that really interesting, because I kind of thought like if you paid them the big bucks, like they'd probably put like, they'd be happy to put quite a lot of things up, as long as it wasn't like sexy or sweary.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? This idea of a billboard being democratic, because the image that I got to my mind was that perhaps anybody who would want to advertise on that billboard having to put a proposal to the community, and the community having to vote for it, to veto it, or to say yes, it's good to go. That sounds like a very interesting idea, and I would love to be able to sort of see that in my mind's eye of how that would look, because because I guess for obviously the majority of my life, of my experiences is seeing that I've never had any choice in that. I do remember watching, I can't remember who it was. It was an interview with, I believe it was a graffiti artist, funny enough, actually. And he was mentioning about how, why is it that I can walk down the street and see a billboard with a half-dressed woman on the billboard, and it create this chemical reaction inside of me that I didn't ask for or want, but yet it's here nonetheless, and like who has the right to do this to me? And obviously that's one individual, and then you think of multiple individuals of that. It's it's very interesting. Yeah, but I do like this idea of having a say potentially of what enters your mind. Oh, I think we cracked up a little bit there.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you froze a little bit. I think you're back now. Or I froze. One or the other.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think it would be quite interesting to be able to have a say into what we see on the street.
Yeah, like I guess, like I haven't finished reading this yet, but it's really interesting, and it's kind of a lot of it is about sort of like about taking direct action. So like, you know, in order to achieve it, they're just going to kind of like, a lot of these people, they open up like bus stops and put in like whatever they want, and it kind of teaches you how to do it. I think I'm going to have to do it one day. Yeah, maybe. I won't tell you because this is public. So if you see it or not, then it might be me or it might
not.
But yeah, like I like this idea of kind of like maybe like commissioning it like an artwork, or I don't know, just I just feel like so many things on billboards like aren't actually doing public good, you know, like they're just trying to sell me something. And you know, the idea of like, it's even says in this book, it says like because capitalism's basic aim is to forever continuously expand, then kind of your just consumption is just forever continuously expanding, and it's just continuing to sell you things. And you know, there's kind of a correlation between the amount of like the amount of kind of like adverts and the hours that people work, and you just work longer hours and more in order to buy things that you're told to buy. And actually I don't want to live like that. Like I want to work as little as possible and do the things that I really enjoy doing, and not be trying to sold stuff, and actually instead maybe look at some nice artwork in front of my eyes while I walk down the street.
Okay, I had a question just as you were talking there. I was thinking, what is it that you would like to create, or have you got any ideas in terms of what you'd like to create if you had the resources to do it and there wasn't anything that was kind of holding you back in that sense? Because I kind of sense that you've thought a lot about obviously the environments that you're in and how that affects your life, and then also how it affects the wider society. So I'm curious to know what society you'd imagine, and what would that look like?
I don't know. Well, I'm a socialist, so I guess a socialist society where everyone is lovely to one another and everyone takes each other's best interests whenever they do anything. I don't know, in terms of never-ending limits, I don't know, not in terms of changing society, but recently I've got into the idea of like housing cooperatives, and that's kind of maybe like a small step of doing something and kind of living with other people and producing things together. I don't know, I feel like I've lost track of the question.
I guess it was just because you'd mentioned about your interest in space and architecture and such. I mean, it might not be something that you've thought a great deal about. I guess it was just a question that was on the spot. I was curious to know whether maybe you had a solid vision in your mind, or some kind of a vision in your mind of what that would look like in terms of colour or aesthetic or anything, or would we be going straight back to the 1960s? That utopian vision, would it just be to make that into a reality?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I guess like I'm really interested in this kind of like past utopias or sort of like retrofuturism, because they were sort of futures that never got the chance to happen. So it was like this promise of something. I think a lot of kind of like, I mean, obviously the climate is like a massive factor in kind of producing new worlds and basically not sucking the earth dry of every resource. But I don't know what I like. I mean, I love the colour orange. Like, I love to think of like Utopia being orange and beautiful, but I guess kind of like the nature of Utopia is it's not just what I want. But if I imagine Utopia, everything will be concrete and orange and lots of lovely greenery, but maybe like eco-concrete, because concrete's bad for the planet. But I spoke to a guy a few years ago who was he was like doing a PhD about making concrete out of rice, which seemed quite promising at the time, but it was a few years ago now, and I don't think I've heard much about it since. But yeah, I don't know, I don't know. I don't really know. I sort of do envision in my head like a sort of concretey 60s thing when I think of Utopia. But I don't know, I'll have to think about it. I guess that's why I do my little silly details, because I can't think of the big stuff.
Okay. So it sounds like you're kind of piecing that idea together anyway. And I very much recognise that as being part of a process anyway, which is there isn't always a solid vision for what it is. Because really, if I'm going to be honest, Eve, I've given you a very, very big question there in terms of trying to imagine a whole society and that kind of thing. Maybe if we just bring it down to sort of like the smaller scale, and that is very much what you're doing, I guess, with your curatorial spaces. And let's first occupy a billboard and see how that goes.
Step one.
As opposed to, right, let's see a whole society kind of thing. Yeah, I'm really interested, I guess, in terms of material, because you've mentioned there about the ethics of certain materials and using certain materials, and you mentioned there about concrete and how, you know, it's not good for the planet, but then the idea that you've got is like for this concrete thing. So I'm wondering if there's maybe like an element of having to wrestle with that in a sense. I don't know if that's the case. I can imagine it in my own sense, because I know for me personally, I feel bad about throwing a piece of plastic in the bin because my local recycling plant won't recycle it, so it has to go in the bin, and I feel bad about that. And then obviously when I'm then creating work, I'm like, this would look really good in epoxy resin, but I can't do that because I have a greater responsibility, and I'm like looking up other types of, you know, eco epoxy resin or something like that. But yeah, I guess that's a different tangent, isn't it, that I'm kind of going on. I had this question that I ask everybody, and I guess in a sense we've kind of already explored it. And if you wanted to pass, we can pass this question. The question goes, if there was one thing that you could change about the world, what would it be? I
don't know, destroy capitalism. Feels, oh God, that's such an awful sort of response, but it sucks. Like, it just really sucks. I really like your sorry, I'm going back again now, but I like your struggle with the plastics and the resin, because I feel like this is something that I struggle with a lot, and I like to think about. I've been kind of trying to think about like what the present will look like as an archaeological layer, and kind of thinking about kind of like how the future will look back on the present day. And a lot of that is to do with waste. I'm really into this idea of like how you handle waste, and obviously I as a person accumulate lots of crap, and I as an artist make lots of crap. So like I like to think about like the things that we throw away all the time, and how they will be relics one day, that someone will dig up. But also kind of the way that we process waste is really interesting, and like once again, it's capitalism, and we just ship it across the world and let children deal with it. But I think from the 1st of January, this was in the case in the US, and I think it must be in the UK, but now we like can't do that. Like China has told us that they don't want any more waste from the rest of the world, so we are kind of basically having to deal with our own recycling and our own waste for the first time, and it'll be interesting to see how that kind of pans out, and how that will be, I guess maybe when we see it more, we'll kind of have to deal with it. But yeah, like a lot of plastic will be in our layer of archaeology, which I think would be quite interesting. But I guess if I could change the world, I guess I would just change the system in which we all live in, because it is destroying the planet, and I just want people to be nice to each other. That's all I want.
I totally agree. And that's kind of what I hope to see, and I guess imagine to see all the time. I am noticing the more I'm asking that question to different people, there is that theme that literally everything you said has kind of been echoed across all the creative people that I've spoken to. And I guess that was part of the reason why I wanted to have conversations with other creative people, was to see if there was something that kind of united all artists together in a sense. And obviously I haven't spoken to a great deal of artists as of yet, but I am enjoying seeing that theme coming across about changing the political system, and get rid of capitalism and wealth accumulation, and save the planet, make it good for the planet. And I guess when I'm thinking about that, I'm also thinking about how does that actually inform somebody making their work? Is that the overarching thing that influences their work, or is that just kind of a side thing that's maybe cast to one side? Because I guess whenever I speak to anyone who's an artist, or even not an artist, I do get the sense of just overwhelming pessimism about the society that we're living in, and there not being a sense that actually artists or creative people could actually help to change that. I do like that answer, and I really hope that there is the capacity for creative people to come together and unite on that front in some sense. This might be because I might be saying this because we've all been struggling with lockdown for a long, long time, and I'm just imagining crowds of people together, on a common theme, and everybody's united. Because we're not seeing a lot of that on the news or anything like that. So, maybe I'm just being very, very optimistic and imagining a utopia.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like the best way to make a utopia happen is like to have that vision. I think like you got to sell people a vision of a positive future, to get people on board. and to make it, kind of realistic. Like I hate the idea, whenever you talk to people about political things and they're like, oh, but that's just not the real world. And it's like, yeah, but like you shape the real world. Like, like if you kind of imagine it, you can kind of like work towards it. And I guess, yeah, that's something that motivates me. But I guess maybe a lot of sort of like artists are kind of like left leaning, is because I guess, I don't know, we've all just been trampled on basically by the government constantly, like, the cuts to arts and things like that. But also maybe it is a sort of like state of mind of like, I feel like there is an artist called Toby Lloyd, and he did a great piece for his PhD a few years ago, and he kind of asked people, would they prefer, if they were given the choice to have more of one thing, would you choose time or money? And because the crowd was full of, I don't know, art goers, like so many people chose time. And I guess it's sort of, I guess it's like where your value's placed, I guess, in kind of like community, or whether it's placed in monetary value. But yeah, I do find that interesting, and kind of like when you find like a famous Tory artist, like, I don't know, like, don't want to name names, but like, Tracy Emin, like that is the thing that everybody knows about her, because you're like, oh, like, because it's quite rare.
I'll admit I didn't know that. I didn't know
that. Yeah, you'll never see her the same way again.
Yeah, I never thought. I am seeing her in a different way now. I'm thinking, how does that marry up, the creation of a bed like that, which just seems so liberal. The bed was just so liberal. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. I'll probably look into that a little bit more. See if there's any more conservative artists out there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, probably do look into it, because I might just be slander right now, but I feel like, I don't know, yeah, I feel like there was pieces going around, sort of like the David Cameron days. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Yeah, you'd wonder what artworks are being held at high regard within conservative homes, in those type of homes, because I'd heard about how generally conservatives, this is literally a generalization, conservatives demonstrate less open-mindedness in some sense, and I'm sure that people would disagree on that side, people who maybe fall into that category, but maybe the trait openness, how open is a creative person, in contrast to someone who isn't creative. I don't know if you've ever heard of, I'm really struggling to remember any names today, but there was this study where they basically got patients who had the left and right hemispheres of the brain cut in half. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, Eve. And what they did was they put one side to sleep. So they put the left side to sleep. And because obviously the brain was already split, there was already a duality there. Because when your brain's connected on both sides, there's a dialogue happening between two sides of the brain. And when they put the left side to sleep, the right side had a completely different personality to the left. Generally, the left side is a lot more authoritative, a lot more directive, a lot more, as you described it before, realistic, sees things in a more rational and logical way. And then the right side is a lot more go-lucky and a lot more creative, a lot more chirpy, optimistic, very open-minded. And I'm wondering whether creative people, well, I imagine they do fall kind of more leaning on towards the right side of the brain than the left. But it'd be interesting to see what a society would look like if we were all dominated by one side or dominated by the other, and just seeing that, or even just imagining that, because to my mind, I kind of get the sense that it feels very left hemisphere at the moment, and maybe you've kind of echoed that with everybody going, well, that's not realistic, that's not the real world.
Yeah, maybe. That's interesting. I'd like to see a right-sided brain world. I mean, I think, it's sort of, it's I don't know, being sensible is kind of needed to an extent. Like, I think, but yeah, kind of what is truly where I feel like the value lies is, having the imagination to see what is possible and going with it. But then maybe sort of like a left-sided brain to kind of like figure out the kinks or the details.
I don't know if you're familiar with anything to do with depression, and how when people have depression, their brain gets stuck into, well, supposedly, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, this is just literally what I've heard. It's the same as anything, really. Anything that I'm saying is just stuff that I've heard, and I'm actually then just repeating to you and thought, oh, that sounds quite interesting, or I'm trying to imagine that. But this idea that someone who does experience depression has pathways in the brain that are quite isolated, quite small, and tend to be the same pattern. And if you ever do have a conversation with someone who has depression, or if you ever experience depression, you might notice that there is like a thought loop, which is, I go to the shops today. Every time I go to the shop, this thing happens. This bad thing always happens to me. And this sort of internal dialogue then starts to influence their mood. And then it just happens on repeat. They're looking for things potentially to go wrong. They spot things that go wrong and then go, oh, look, there it goes again. So they kind of reaffirm the pattern, and the pattern repeats itself. And it's interesting, this idea of maybe just thinking beyond what your conception of possibility is, just for a moment. Just kind of step outside of that for a second. Let's imagine for a second that we could create a system where there is no plastic in the rubbish. If we were to just imagine that for a second, then we can maybe ask the question of, okay, so how would we do that? So ask the imagine the impossible, and then try to think of what the questions would be to get us there. Because personally, I think that, I'm very optimistic that if we ask ourselves the right questions, then we can get to the right answers, or we can find the solutions to the problems. But that might be a creative thing. That might be the right side of the brain talking. But I'd like to believe that.
Yeah, I guess, it's sort of maybe on a similar wavelength, but like I got, last year I got quite into the idea of like sci-fi as a means to figure out the future, or sort of kind of like as a useful tool. So you kind of like write a future that exists, and kind of like all of these things that have happened within it, and then kind of like using that as a way to work backwards and how you would kind of create it within society, and kind of like this idea of almost like fictioning utopias. So you kind of like make the thing happen in your mind first, and then kind of work towards kind of creating that afterwards, which I think is such a really cool and exciting tool. That, I mean, I never really thought of myself as like a big sci-fi fan, and I probably still don't, but I think the concept of sci-fi is something that really excites me, this kind of idea of possibility, and using that to kind of like using these mad ideas to sort of influence the world at present, potentially.
I love this idea of sci-fi as well, and you're not the first person who's kind of mentioned about the influence of sci-fi on their own practice and such. I do really like this idea of something being birthed out of the imagination of a creative person, it taking form in a book or something, that book then turning into a film, entering into people's minds in a lot more vivid sense, and then that actually going, okay, let's try and create something close to that. Because I don't know about you, but I've kind of sensed that all of a sudden lasers are something that they're actually doing things. Like, as a child, I remember growing up and lasers were like this thing in Star Trek or Star Wars, and lasers could chop down trees and all this stuff. And then the more you're hearing about lasers, the more it feels like it's getting closer to sci-fi. I don't know if you're noticing anything like that maybe some of the things that you maybe thought about when you're a child or younger, and then all of a sudden they start to become a reality as you get older. So I'm wondering if there's maybe a sense of sci-fi sort of predicts what's going to happen in a sense, or is able to sort of be a few steps ahead before things actually happen.
Yeah, definitely. Because I feel like, I don't know, like, you'd never thought, like, I mean, my dad says it all the time. You know, he's always like, oh, when I was young, I would have never imagined, you know, that I could, like, just look something up in my hand. You know, he's always like, you know, if I wanted to know something, like, I'd go to the library, or like, you know, or he's like, well, I mean, as if he ever went to the library, I don't think he did. I mean, he's very clever, but, you know, or sort of like, oh, you know, like if I was going to meet a friend, like, I'd have to just like arrange the time before, like a time and like a place, and just hope that they turned up, and like all this stuff that, like, it feels like kind of like in old sort of films and stuff, like that has always been a possibility. Like I feel like Apple Watches, like, and like Fitbits and stuff, like that has always been like a sort of like James Bond-esque, like, I don't know, sci-fi type of thing, to like have like a computer like on your wrist as a watch. And like it feels funny thinking about it now and being like, oh, that's like a very common thing now. And it but like when it happens in the present, you don't think of it being very sci-fi. I think you sort of forget that you forget what's happening at the time that it's happening, until you sort of like look back or kind of think forward. But yeah, it's quite interesting to see how quick things are moving, and kind of you don't notice it happening until it's too late.
Until it's too late. I'm hoping that was an optimistic too late, rather than everything's going too fast, because sometimes I get trapped in that thinking, things are changing too quickly and we're not understanding the impact of things. But if we try to always look at the positive, hopefully that's the better thing to do, maybe not being stuck in the negative of everything. Because I'm getting a large sense that is happening a lot. We're thinking about how we're living our lives and focusing on the negative, but maybe focusing a little bit more on what direction are we going in, and what are the positives of that, and hopefully in the process catching all of the side effects and putting them into a nice sort of ecosystem where they get recycled and turned into something beautiful like a garden or something like that. Eve, I'm just wondering, in terms of anyone who's listening, where can people find you and find out about your work?
So I have a website. It's evelyncromwell.weebly.com. I still haven't bought the domain yet, and I don't know whether I ever will. And I'm Evelyn Cromwell on Instagram. You can find my curatorial stuff on spaghetto_factoro, because the Spaghetti Factory is a real place. I think it already exists. I think it's like a pasta restaurant or something. So all of our branding has to be Spaghetto Factoro, because, you know, the real company's taken off. And this sort of like new venture on sort of like furniture or functional design I'm under Tantrum Design. I've got a lot of Instagrams to be pinging and running. But yeah, that's me.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, it was lovely having a chat with you, Eve. And we'll keep in touch. I'm definitely curious to see about what new projects got kind of blossom from yourself, and also like what the artwork, how that becomes informed possibly after coming out of COVID. I don't know if that would be something that would have an impact, but yeah, I'm curious to see what comes out. Thank you,
Yeah.
Eve. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been absolutely lush. Thank you.
Thank you.